Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the hallway light flickered at odd intervals. Comings and goings were routine, a shuffle of footsteps that no one bothered to track. The mail piled neatly, except for the one envelope that always seemed to be missing. I didn't turn to see or ask who took it. It simply belonged somewhere else. The room felt a degree cooler than it should have been, and the curtains hung just a bit unevenly. I adjusted the blinds without thinking much of it. When I left, I made sure the blinds were uneven again. To whoever finds this letter, if anyone ever does, I'm writing because I can't carry this anymore. The weight of it sits behind my ribs like swallowed glass. Every breath reminds me. Every silence between heartbeats whispers that something changed that night, and I haven't been the same person since. Maybe I'm not a person at all anymore. You'll think I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. Maybe I lost it completely, and this is just the echo of what's left, scratching words onto paper like a ghost trying to prove it once existed. But I need to tell someone, even if that someone is just the empty air that seems to listen now more than any living thing ever did. The envelope, that's where it started, I think. Or maybe it started long before and the envelope was just when I finally noticed. It was always there in the morning, always gone by evening. Never addressed to anyone I could see, never with a return address. Just clean white paper that felt too smooth between my fingers, like it had been handled by something that didn't quite understand the texture of human skin. I started watching for who took it. Stupid, really. Like watching for the exact moment you fall asleep or trying to catch your reflection blinking first. The harder I looked, the more it slipped away from me, but I felt them watching back. The light above kept its irregular rhythm. 3 quick flickers, pause, 1 long dim pause, then steady for exactly 47 seconds before starting again. I counted everything after that. Steps in the hallway, always 13 going one way, 14 coming back. The temperature drop was always 3 degrees, never more, never less. The curtains moved 17 inches to the left every time I straightened them. Everything had a number, everything had a pattern, everything except me. I started leaving the blinds crooked on purpose. A test, maybe, a signal, I don't know what I expected, but they stayed exactly as crooked as I made them until the next morning when they'd be straight again. Not straight like I'd straightened them, straight like they'd never been touched by human hands at all. Perfect, mechanical, wrong. The footsteps in the hallway got softer, not quieter, softer, like whoever was making them was learning to walk more carefully, more thoughtfully. Like they were trying not to disturb something or someone, like they knew I was listening now. My reflection started avoiding eye contact. I know how that sounds. Reflections don't avoid anything. They just are, but mine would look slightly to the left or right, like it was watching something just behind my shoulder. When I turned to check, there was never anything there. When I turned back, my reflection was looking the other direction. The mirror in the bathroom was worst. I'd catch glimpses of myself brushing my teeth, and my reflection would be brushing too, but a half second behind, or ahead. The rhythm was off, like a song played at the wrong speed. Sometimes I'd stop moving just to see what would happen. My reflection would finish the motion I'd started, then stand there waiting patiently for me to catch up. Sleep became difficult, not because I couldn't fall asleep, but because I wasn't sure I was waking up in the same place I'd closed my eyes. The room looked identical. Everything was where it should be, but the air felt different, thicker, like it was holding its breath. I started finding things I didn't remember putting places. A glass of water on the nightstand that was exactly half empty. A book open to a page I'd never read, with a sentence underlined in pencil I didn't own. The space between thoughts is where we live. I don't remember buying that book. I don't remember learning to read that language. The envelope kept appearing. I tried staying awake all night to catch who delivered it, but every time I blinked, just blinked, it was there. Clean, white, patient, like it had been waiting for me to notice it forever. I opened one. Inside was a photograph of the hallway. My hallway, but empty. No mail pile, no uneven curtains, no flickering light, just clean walls and perfect silence captured in black and white. On the back, in handwriting that looked almost like mine but not quite, were the words, "This is what it looked like before you." Before me what? Before I moved in, before I started noticing, before I started changing things. Or before I started becoming something else. The people in the building began treating me differently, not rudely, not obviously, but like I was slightly out of focus. They'd look through me first, then at me, like their eyes needed a moment to adjust. Conversations would pause when I walked by, not because they were talking about me, but because they'd forgotten what they were saying, like I was interfering with some signal they couldn't quite name. My name stopped sounding right when other people said it. The syllables felt foreign in their mouths, like they were speaking a word from a language they'd never learned. I started avoiding introductions, started avoiding conversations altogether. It was easier. The numbers kept multiplying. 17 steps to the elevator, 11 seconds for the doors to close, 23 floors, but the button for the 13th was worn smoother than the others, like it had been pressed more often than it should have been. The building only had 22 floors. I pressed it once. The elevator didn't stop, it didn't go up or down, it just paused like it was thinking. The lights dimmed to that same degree of coolness I felt in my room. The silence was so complete I could hear my blood moving. And for just a moment I swear I heard footsteps above me. Soft, careful footsteps walking in patterns I was starting to recognize. When the doors opened, I was on my floor, my hallway, but the envelope was already there, even though I'd just left, even though it was the middle of the night, even though no one else was awake. This time I didn't take it inside. I left it where it was and went to bed. In the morning, there were two. I stopped eating regularly. Food tasted like the memory of taste, like my tongue was forgetting how to be hungry. I lost weight, but not in any way that made sense. I looked the same in photographs, but felt lighter, like I was slowly becoming optional, like reality was trying to decide whether it still needed me. The dreams were the hardest part. Not nightmares. I could have handled nightmares. These were dreams of perfect normalcy. Dreams where the light didn't flicker, where my reflection looked me in the eye, where envelopes stayed delivered and footsteps had owners. Dreams where I felt solid and warm and completely, utterly alone in the most beautiful way. I'd wake up disappointed. The Watchers, because that's what I started calling them, the presence I felt but never saw, became more obvious. Not visible, but present, like the feeling of someone standing just outside your peripheral vision, except everywhere, all the time. They weren't malicious. They weren't even particularly interested in me. I was just something that had wandered into their space and hadn't left yet. Maybe I couldn't leave. Maybe I didn't want to. The envelopes multiplied faster, 3, then 5, then 12, all identical, all empty except for photographs of places I'd been moments before I'd been there. The grocery store with my cart already full of things I hadn't picked yet. The park bench still warm from where I was about to sit, my own footprints in snow that hadn't fallen. They were documenting me or preparing for me. I couldn't tell which. I tried moving out, packed everything I owned into boxes that felt lighter than they should have. But when I got to the new place, the hallway light flickered at odd intervals. The mail piled neatly, except for one envelope. The room was exactly 3 degrees too cold. I hadn't brought the watchers with me. I had become the thing that made them necessary. You're probably wondering what I am now, what I've become. I wish I could tell you. I wish I understood it myself. All I know is that I'm writing this letter, and when I finish, I'm going to leave it where someone might find it. Maybe in a pile of mail, maybe under a door, maybe in an envelope that appears and disappears according to rules I'm still learning. I'm not warning you exactly. I'm not asking for help. I think I'm just documenting the way they documented me, the way I'm learning to document others. Because I've started noticing things about the people in this new building, the way they adjust their blinds, the way they count steps without realizing it, the way they pause sometimes, like they're listening for something just outside their understanding. And I've started leaving envelopes. Not maliciously, not with any plan, just because it seems like the right thing to do, because someone should know what it looks like before they become whatever comes next, because the watchers need something to watch, and I'm learning that being watched isn't the frightening part. The frightening part is realizing you've become the one doing the watching. My reflection looks me in the eye now, but I'm not sure it's my reflection anymore. I'm not sure I'm me anymore. I'm not sure it matters. The light above my head flickers in patterns I recognize. The footsteps in the hallway are soft and careful and exactly the right number. The temperature is perfect for whatever I'm becoming. If you find this letter, if you're reading these words, then you've probably already started noticing things. Small things, numbers that repeat, sounds that follow patterns, spaces that feel like they're waiting for something. Don't fight it, don't try to understand it, just let it happen. Let yourself become whatever you're becoming. The watchers aren't cruel, they're just patient, and eventually you'll understand what they're waiting for. Eventually, you'll understand that they were waiting for you to become one of them. The envelope will appear soon. You'll know which one. You'll know what to do with it. And someday, if you're like me, you'll write your own letter. You'll try to explain what can't be explained. You'll try to warn someone who can't be warned. And you'll realize that the letter isn't for them. It's for whoever you used to be. Story 2. I had been watching the floorboards, eyes tracing the familiar lines where the wood met the wall. The shadows didn't shift, but something in the air felt charged, like a held breath. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the windows, a soft murmur that might have been mistaken for an echo. Each tick of the ceiling fan seemed amplified, its rhythm oddly irregular. My gaze caught the edge of the bookshelf where the dust had settled uniformly, untouched. Yet something had changed, an inexplicable lightness in the room. That's when I noticed the single bookmark lying on the floor and that it was never mine. I keep trying to remember what came before that moment. The doctors say fragments will surface, that memory works in waves, not straight lines. But these aren't waves, they're shards of glass cutting through fog, each piece reflecting something I can't quite see. The bookmark was burgundy leather. I know this with absolute certainty, though I can't explain why that detail feels so important. My fingers remember the texture before my mind does smooth, worn at the edges like someone had been worrying it between their thumb and forefinger for years, but whose fingers, mine, the weight of it in my palm was wrong somehow, too heavy for something so thin. There's a sound that keeps coming back, a low hum, not mechanical but organic, like breathing through water. It starts in my dreams and follows me into waking hours, settling behind my eardrums like pressure before a storm. Sometimes I think it's the refrigerator in the kitchen, but when I check, the refrigerator is silent. Sometimes I think it's coming from inside my own chest. I remember standing in a hallway. The walls were that institutional green that makes you think of hospitals or old schools, paint chipped near the baseboards where countless shoes had scuffed against them. There was a door at the end, and light was bleeding out from underneath it, not warm light, but cold and blue like the glow from a television screen. I was walking toward it, my bare feet making no sound on the linoleum, and I could hear that humming getting louder with each step. But was that real, or was it from one of those movies I watched afterward, during the long afternoons when I couldn't sleep and couldn't stay awake either? The mind plays tricks when it's trying to fill in blanks. The doctors warned me about that too. What I know for certain, my hands shake when I hold coffee cups now. The tremor is slight, barely noticeable to anyone else, but I feel it like an earthquake in my bones. The coffee tastes different too, metallic, like I'm drinking it through coins. I've switched brands 3 times, thinking it was the coffee, but the taste follows me. There was someone else in the room with me that day. I can feel their presence like a shadow cast by invisible light. They were sitting in the chair by the window, the one with the faded blue cushion that I never use because it faces away from the door. I don't like having my back to doorways anymore, though I can't remember why. This person, were they a friend, a stranger? They were very still, unnaturally still, like they were holding their breath or like they had forgotten how to breathe entirely. I called out to them, I'm almost sure I did. My throat remembers the strain of speaking, the way your voice sounds different when you're afraid and trying not to show it. But they didn't answer. They didn't even turn their head, just sat there with their shoulders squared to the window, watching something I couldn't see. The smell hits me at random moments. It's sharp and clean, like antiseptic mixed with ozone, the way the air smells right before lightning strikes. It clings to my clothes sometimes, even fresh from the laundry. I'll catch a whiff and suddenly I'm somewhere else, not the hallway with the green walls, but a smaller space, enclosed, where the air doesn't move and every breath tastes recycled. My reflection looks wrong in mirrors now. Not dramatically different, nothing anyone else would notice, but my eyes seem wider somehow, like I'm perpetually startled. The pupils dilate and contract at odd moments, responding to light that isn't there. I've started avoiding mirrors when I can, brushing my teeth with my eyes closed, looking away when I pass storefront windows. There's a pattern in the ceiling above my bed, water stains from some old leak that was fixed before I moved in. 3 irregular circles overlapping like a Venn diagram, and sometimes when I'm lying there in the dark, they seem to pulse with their own dim light. I know this is impossible. Water stains don't glow, but knowledge and experience are different countries now, and I'm not sure which one I'm living in. The person in the chair had long hair. I think it was long. It fell forward, obscuring their face, dark against the pale fabric of their shirt, or was it a hospital gown? The details shift every time I try to focus on them, like trying to read in a dream. But I remember thinking their hair looked wet, though there was no reason for it to be wet. It hung in heavy strands, and I had the strangest urge to reach out and touch it, to see if my fingers would come away damp. I didn't, though. Something stopped me. Some instinct deeper than thought kept my hands at my sides. The bookmark had writing on it, not printed text, but handwriting in blue ink that had faded to gray at the edges. I can almost see the words when I close my eyes and concentrate, but they slip away like water through cupped palms. They weren't in English, I think, or maybe they were English, but arranged in a way that made no sense. The letters seemed familiar and foreign at the same time, like a language I had once known but forgotten. Sometimes I wake up and my sheets are soaked with sweat, but I'm cold, shivering despite the dampness. The dreams that cause this are never clear when I wake, just impressions, the The sensation of falling without moving, of speaking without making sound, of being watched by eyes that reflect no light. I've started sleeping with the lights on, but even then, the corners of the room seem to hold more shadow than they should. The humming is getting stronger. It's not just in my dreams anymore, or in those half-awake moments between sleep and consciousness. It's there when I'm making breakfast, when I'm reading, when I'm trying to write down these fragments before they dissolve. It seems to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, like the room itself is resonating at a frequency just below the range of normal hearing. I went back to look for the bookmark, but it wasn't where I remembered dropping it. The floor was clean, no dust patterns to show where something had been lying. But the absence felt deliberate, like someone had carefully removed it while I wasn't looking. The thought of someone in my space, moving things, touching my belongings while I slept or showered or stared blankly at the ceiling, makes my skin crawl with invisible insects. The person in the chair never moved. I stood there for what felt like hours, though time moved strangely in memory, stretching and compressing like taffy, waiting for them to acknowledge me, to turn around, to give some sign that they knew I was there. But they remained perfectly motionless, and gradually I began to wonder if they were breathing at all. The rise and fall of their shoulders was so subtle it might have been my imagination trying to impose life onto stillness. My hands remember touching something cold and smooth, metal maybe, or glass warmed by skin until it felt like neither. It was important, this object, though I can't recall what it was or why it mattered. The memory exists only in my fingertips, a phantom sensation that returns when I'm not expecting it. Sometimes I catch myself running my hands over surfaces, tabletops, door frames, the spines of books, searching for that particular texture, that specific temperature. The light under the door was pulsing, not flickering like a bad bulb, but breathing like a living thing. Bright, dim, in a rhythm that almost matched my heartbeat, but not quite. The discrepancy was maddening, like trying to clap along to music that's slightly off tempo. I wanted to synchronize with it, to match my pulse to its rhythm, but every time I tried, it would shift, just a fraction of a second off, keeping me perpetually out of sync. There are gaps in my days now. I'll be reading a book and suddenly realize I've been staring at the same page for hours, or I'll find myself standing in the kitchen with no memory of walking there. These lost moments feel heavy with significance, as if important things are happening in the spaces between my awareness, but I can't access them. It's like being locked out of my own experience. The antiseptic smell is stronger in the bathroom. I've scrubbed every surface, replaced the soap, the shampoo, even the towels, but it persists. Sometimes it's so strong it makes my eyes water, and I have to leave the room to breathe. Other times it's barely there, just a hint at the edge of perception, but somehow that's worse. At least when it's overpowering, I know I'm not imagining it. I think the person in the chair was waiting for something. There was a quality of expectation in their stillness, like an actor frozen in the moment before their cue. But what were they waiting for? And why did I have the feeling that I was supposed to know, that this was part of some script I had forgotten learning? The ceiling fan still ticks irregularly. I've had it checked twice, but the repair people say there's nothing wrong with it. The motor is fine, the blades are balanced, all the connections are secure. Yet the rhythm remains erratic, sometimes speeding up for no reason, sometimes slowing down until I think it might stop entirely. The sound has become a soundtrack to my reconstruction of these fragments, an unreliable metronome for unreliable memories. My reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes seems to be moving a split second before I do, like it's anticipating my movements rather than mimicking them. I'll lift my hand and swear I saw the reflection start to move first, but when I try to catch it happening, everything appears normal. The mirror shows exactly what it should show, nothing more, nothing less, but the feeling of being slightly behind my own reflection persists. The bookmark is back, not on the floor where I first found it, but on my nightstand, placed precisely parallel to the edge of the table like someone arranged it with a ruler. The burgundy leather looks exactly as I remembered, worn smooth at the edges, heavy in a way that defies its thinness. But the writing has changed, or maybe I'm remembering it wrong. The blue ink that had faded to gray is now sharp and dark, as if it were written yesterday. I still can't read it. The humming has developed harmonics. What started as a single low tone now has overtones, creating chords that shouldn't be possible from a single source. Sometimes I think I can almost make out words in the sound, syllables forming and dissolving in the resonance. But when I try to focus on them, they scatter like startled birds, leaving only the original hum. I remember now that the person in the chair was wearing my clothes. Not similar clothes, my exact shirt, the blue one with the small stain near the left cuff that I got from spilling coffee 3 weeks before. My jeans, faded in the same places mine are faded. Even my shoes, scuffed in the same pattern for my particular way of walking. But how could that be possible? I was wearing those clothes. I looked down and saw them on my own body. Yet there they were again, on the motionless figure by the window. The water stains on my ceiling have definitely changed. The 3 overlapping circles have become 4, then 5, expanding like ripples on a pond. Each night there's a new ring, and each night they seem to glow a little brighter in the darkness. I've checked the roof, the pipes, everything that could cause water damage, but there's no source for new leaks. The stains appear to be growing from the inside out, like the ceiling is remembering water that was never there. My hands are steady now when I hold coffee cups, but only because I've stopped drinking coffee. The metallic taste had become unbearable, like swallowing liquid mercury. Water tastes strange too, though not as bad. Everything I put in my mouth carries a faint echo of that antiseptic smell, that ozone sharpness that clings to the back of my throat. The light under the door went out. I remember that moment with perfect clarity, though I can't place it in sequence with anything else. 1 second it was pulsing with that cold blue glow, and the next it was gone, leaving the hallway in complete darkness. But the darkness wasn't empty. It had weight and texture, pressing against my skin like velvet curtains. I could feel it moving around me, not random air currents but purposeful motion, as if the darkness itself was alive and curious about my presence. I think I opened the door. The memory is there but wrapped in gauze, muffled and indistinct. The handle was cold under my palm, colder than metal should be in a heated building. It turned easily, too easily, like it wanted to be opened. But what was on the other side? The memory stops there, cut off as cleanly as if someone had taken scissors to a film strip. The person in the chair is gone now, but the impression of their weight remains in the cushion. The fabric is compressed in the exact shape of a human form, and sometimes I think I can see the indentation moving slightly, as if invisible lungs are still drawing breath. I've tried sitting in the chair myself, but I can't make the depression go away. My weight doesn't seem to register on the fabric at all. Something is stirring in the spaces between these fragments. I can feel it gathering strength, pulling the scattered pieces together into a pattern I'm not sure I want to see. The bookmark appears in different places now, on the kitchen counter, on the bathroom sink, once inside the refrigerator next to a carton of milk that had gone sour without my noticing. Each time the writing seems clearer, more urgent, though still incomprehensible. The humming has become constant. It's not just in quiet moments anymore, but underneath everything, a bass note that makes my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly at the edges. I've started hearing it in other people's voices, in the sound of traffic, in the white noise of appliances. The whole world seems to be vibrating at that same impossible frequency. I know something is about to change. I can feel it building like pressure in my skull, like thunder before it breaks. The fragments are aligning themselves, forming connections I hadn't seen before. The person in the chair, the bookmark, the light under the door, the antiseptic smell, they're all part of the same event, the same moment that my mind has been trying to protect me from remembering. But the protection is failing. The walls I built around that memory are crumbling, and whatever is on the other side is beginning to bleed through. I can almost see it now, almost understand what happened in that room with the institutional green walls and the figure wearing my clothes and the light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The bookmark is in my hand now, though I don't remember picking it up. The writing is moving, rearranging itself as I watch, and for the first time I can almost make out what it says. The words are forming, becoming clear, and I realize they're not in a foreign language at all. They're in my own handwriting, in my own words, but from a time I can't remember writing them. They say, "You are ready to remember." The humming stops. The silence that follows is so complete it feels solid, like I could reach out and touch it. In that silence, I can hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, and underneath it all, the sound of someone else breathing in perfect synchronization with me. I'm not alone in this room. I never was. The person in the chair isn't gone. They're here, right here, and they've been waiting for me to remember. The memory is coming back now, flowing like water through a broken dam, and I understand finally what I've been trying so hard to forget. The light is beginning to pulse again, but this time it's coming from inside me. Story 3. It wasn't the first time the window was open in the morning. The curtains barely shifted, hanging more out of habit than function. A stray leaf lay on the floor, despite the room being sealed tight the night before. I swept it into the bin without a second thought. The air felt a touch cooler, but the thermostat showed no change. I straightened the cushions on the couch, noting the slight indentation in one of them. The remote control was exactly where it should have been, untouched since yesterday. When I left the room, I made sure to close the door softly. I didn't mind if it stayed ajar. The first dream came on a Tuesday, or maybe it was a Wednesday. Those distinctions don't seem to matter anymore. I was lying in bed, that familiar weight of sleep pulling me down like warm water. Everything felt normal at first. The room looked exactly as it should, shadows falling in their usual places, but there was something else. A light. Not bright, not harsh, just there, an oval shape hovering somewhere above me, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat. I watched it for what felt like hours, though in dreams time moves differently. The light didn't illuminate anything around it. It simply existed, breathing in that steady rhythm. When I woke up, I felt rested, more rested than I'd felt in weeks. I told myself it was stress. Work had been demanding lately, and my mind was probably just processing the day's tensions. The light was probably just the reflection of a passing car on the ceiling, transformed by sleep into something more mysterious. Dreams do that. They take ordinary things and wrap them in strangeness. But the dream came back. The second time I was in the same position, lying on my back, staring up at that oval light. Only now I could hear something. A low hum, constant and steady, like the sound of electricity running through power lines, but softer, more intimate, as if someone had found the exact frequency that resonated with my bones. The light pulsed in time with the hum, or maybe the hum followed the light. I couldn't tell which came first. I tried to move, to turn my head, but my body felt heavy, disconnected. Not paralyzed exactly, more like I was floating in thick liquid, every movement requiring tremendous effort. That's when I heard the voice. It was distant, metallic, like words being spoken through old radio static. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the tone was calm, almost soothing. The voice seemed to be coming from the light itself, though that didn't make sense. Lights don't speak. But in dreams, anything can happen. I woke up with that hum still echoing in my ears. It faded after a few minutes, but the memory of it stayed with me all day. I found myself humming the same frequency while making coffee, stopping only when I realized what I was doing. The next few days passed normally. Work, meals, television, sleep, routine, but I started noticing things, small things, the kind of details you usually overlook. My coffee mug was on the wrong side of the sink one morning. I always placed it on the left, but there it was on the right. When I opened my laptop, the screen brightness was turned all the way up, though I always kept it at half. There was a small mark on my forearm about the size of a pinprick that I didn't remember getting. It didn't hurt, didn't itch, it was just there. I told myself these were coincidences. Everyone misremembers small details. Everyone has minor injuries they can't explain, bumping into door frames, scratching against rough surfaces. The body accumulates these tiny mysteries. But the dreams kept coming. The third time, everything was more vivid. The light was closer now, maybe 3 feet above my face. I could see its surface rippling like liquid mercury, though it cast no shadows. The hum had grown stronger, and now I could feel it as much as hear it. It vibrated through my chest, my spine, the base of my skull. The voice was clearer too, still metallic, still distant, but I could almost make out words. Almost. It was like trying to remember a song you'd heard once, years ago. The melody was familiar, but the lyrics stayed just out of reach. I tried again to move, to sit up, to turn away from the light, but my body wouldn't respond. I wasn't afraid, though. That was the strange part. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt calm, safe even, as if I were being cared for by something that understood me better than I understood myself. The dream lasted longer this time, much longer. I watched the light pulse, felt the hum resonate through my bones, listened to that almost familiar voice. When I finally woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. I'd slept for nearly 12 hours, but I felt like I'd been awake the entire time. That's when the bleeding started. Not literal bleeding, but the dreams began to seep into my waking hours. I'd be sitting at my desk, typing, and suddenly I'd hear that hum. Faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the air conditioning, but unmistakably the same frequency. I'd look around, trying to locate the source, but it would fade before I could pinpoint it. The light came next, quick flashes in my peripheral vision, oval shapes that vanished the moment I turned my head. I started to wonder if I was having eye problems. Migraines maybe, but I felt fine otherwise, better than fine actually. That deep, restful feeling from the dreams was carrying over into my daily life. I found myself losing track of time more often. I'd sit down to read and suddenly realize hours had passed without me turning a single page. I'd start cooking dinner and come back to awareness with the meal already prepared, though I couldn't remember making it. My body was moving through the motions of daily life, but my mind was somewhere else. Somewhere with that pulsing light and that gentle hum. The fourth dream was different. This time I wasn't in my bedroom. I was in a space that felt both enclosed and infinite, like being inside a vast sphere. The walls, if they were walls, seemed to curve away in all directions. The light was everywhere now, not just above me, but surrounding me, suffusing everything with that soft, breathing glow. The hum had become a symphony. Multiple frequencies layering over each other, creating harmonies I'd never heard before, beautiful and complex and somehow sad. The voice was clearer now, speaking in patterns that almost sounded like language, almost like words I should know but had forgotten. I was floating, suspended in the light and sound. My body felt weightless but also more present than it had ever been. I could feel every cell, every nerve ending, every electric impulse racing through my brain. I was more awake in this dream than I'd ever been while conscious. Time moved strangely. I felt like I was there for days, weeks even, but also just for an instant. The light pulsed faster, the hum grew more intense, and the voice became urgent, insistent. It was trying to tell me something important, something I needed to remember. But then I woke up. Only I wasn't sure I had woken up. My bedroom looked the same, but it felt different. The shadows fell at wrong angles. The air tasted metallic, like the aftermath of lightning. I sat up and noticed my sheets were perfectly smooth, as if I hadn't moved all night. But I could still feel the weightlessness, still hear echoes of that complex harmony. I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked normal, tired maybe, but normal, except for my eyes. They seemed brighter somehow, more alert, as if they'd seen things they weren't supposed to see. The mark on my forearm had changed. It was still small, still didn't hurt, but now it was perfectly circular. Too perfect to be natural, like it had been made with some kind of precise instrument. I touched it and felt a brief pulse of that familiar hum. The contamination accelerated after that. I'd be having conversations and suddenly realize I'd lost minutes, sometimes longer. The other person would be looking at me strangely, waiting for a response to something I hadn't heard them say. I'd excuse myself, blame fatigue, but I could see the concern in their faces. Electronics started acting up around me. My phone would randomly change brightness, cycling from dim to blazing bright in that same pulsing rhythm. The television would develop interference, static patterns that looked almost like the oval light from my dreams. My computer would make sounds, soft electronic tones that reminded me of that distant voice. I began to suspect that the dreams weren't dreams at all. The thought came to me gradually, like dawn breaking. What if I'd been somewhere else during those hours of sleep? What if something had been happening to me, something real and physical, but the memories had been wrapped in dream logic to make them easier to accept? The mark on my arm was real. The electronic interference was real. The lost time was real. But that was impossible. I would remember being taken somewhere, wouldn't I? I would remember leaving my bed, my room, my house, unless the memories had been altered somehow. Unless whatever was happening to me had the ability to edit my recollections, to make the extraordinary seem like nothing more than vivid dreams. I started staying awake, fighting sleep, drinking coffee, keeping lights on, but exhaustion always won eventually. And when it did, the dreams would return stronger than before. The fifth dream was the most vivid yet. I was back in that curved space, but now I could see more details. The walls weren't walls at all, but surfaces covered in patterns of light, geometric shapes that shifted and flowed like living things. The oval light was still there, but now I could see it was just one of many. They moved in formation, a constellation of gentle illumination. The voice was speaking directly to me now, not in words but in concepts that appeared fully formed in my mind. It was explaining something, showing me something important, about memory, about perception, about the thin boundary between what we think is real and what actually is. I understood that I'd been chosen for something, not randomly, but because of some quality I possessed, some compatibility that made me suitable for their purpose. The dreams weren't dreams, they were preparations, training sessions, gradual adjustments to help me accept what was happening. But accept what exactly? The voice tried to explain, flooding my mind with images and sensations I couldn't quite grasp. I saw myself from the outside, lying in that sphere of light, connected to devices I couldn't identify. I saw other people, other subjects, all floating peacefully in their own cocoons of illumination. I saw vast spaces filled with technology beyond my comprehension, operated by beings I couldn't quite focus on. And then I saw something that made everything else fade away. I saw my empty bedroom, my undisturbed bed, the window that was always somehow open in the morning despite being closed the night before. I woke up screaming. But no sound came out. My throat was raw, as if I'd been screaming for hours, but the room was silent. My sheets were soaked with sweat, and there was that metallic taste in my mouth again, stronger now, almost overwhelming. I stumbled to the bathroom and turned on the light. My reflection looked wrong, not dramatically different, but off in subtle ways. My hair was slightly messed, as if I'd been lying in a different position than I remembered. There were faint marks on my temples, barely visible unless I turned my head just right. And the mark on my forearm had multiplied, 3 perfect circles now, arranged in a triangle. They didn't hurt, but when I touched them, I could feel that hum resonating under my skin. I knew then that I was losing the ability to distinguish between the dreams and reality. Or maybe there had never been a distinction to begin with. Maybe what I thought of as my normal life was just another kind of dream, a comfortable fiction to help me process experiences my mind couldn't otherwise handle. The bleeding between states became constant. I'd be walking down the street and suddenly hear that complex harmony echoing off the buildings. I'd see oval lights reflected in windows, in puddles, in the surfaces of passing cars. The voice would whisper to me in quiet moments, sharing fragments of that incomprehensible knowledge. People started avoiding me. I could see it in their faces, the way they looked at me when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I was changing, becoming something they instinctively recognized as different, other, not quite human anymore, or perhaps more human than I'd ever been before. The dreams came every night now, each one more real than the last. I stopped trying to fight them. There was no point. Whatever was happening to me had been happening for a long time, probably longer than I could remember. The dreams were just the part I was allowed to see, the acceptable face of a process that was far more profound and disturbing. I began to understand that memory itself was fluid, editable. That consciousness was more fragile than we like to believe, that the boundary between self and other, between inside and outside, was just a convenient illusion. The beings in the light weren't malevolent. They were careful, methodical, almost gentle in their approach, but they were also completely alien in their motivations. They saw us as we might see laboratory animals, deserving of care but not consultation. They were studying us, changing us, preparing us for something we couldn't comprehend. And I was one of their best subjects. The 6th dream lasted 3 days, or maybe 3 minutes. Time had become meaningless. I floated in that sphere of light, feeling my consciousness expand and contract like a breathing lung. The voice spoke continuously now, downloading information directly into my mind. Histories of other worlds, other species they'd encountered and studied. Technologies that operated on principles our science hadn't even imagined. I learned that they'd been visiting us for a very long time, selecting individuals who met their criteria. Not for any grand purpose, not to save or destroy us, but simply to understand. We were a curiosity to them, a species balanced on the edge between primitive and advanced, between individual and collective consciousness. They showed me my role in their research, how my brain patterns, my psychological profile, my genetic markers made me an ideal subject for their experiments. They were mapping human consciousness, learning how our minds constructed reality from the chaos of sensory input, and I was helping them do it, whether I wanted to or not. When I finally returned to my bedroom, to what I still thought of as the real world, I found evidence of my absence everywhere. Days of mail piled up outside my door, voicemails from concerned friends and colleagues. My plants wilted from lack of water, but I had no memory of being gone. In my mind, I'd simply gone to sleep and woken up just like always. Except for the marks on my arms. They covered both forearms now, dozens of perfect circles arranged in complex patterns, and they were glowing, faintly but unmistakably, a soft blue light that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. I didn't bother trying to cover them up anymore. What was the point? Anyone who saw them would either dismiss them as a trick of the light or recognize them for what they really were. And if they recognized them, it meant they were probably subjects too. The contamination was complete now. I could no longer tell where the dreams ended and reality began. The oval lights were everywhere, visible in broad daylight, casting their impossible shadows. The hum was constant, a background frequency that colored every moment of my existence. The voice spoke to me throughout the day, offering commentary on everything I experienced. I realized I was no longer entirely myself. Part of me was still here, still maintaining the routines of human life, but another part was somewhere else entirely. Connected to that vast network of light and consciousness, participating in research I could barely comprehend. The other subjects were out there too. I could sense them sometimes, brief glimpses of minds touched by the same impossible experiences. We were all nodes in a larger experiment, data points in a study that spanned years, maybe decades. And still the dreams continued. Tonight's dream feels different from the others. I'm back in my bedroom, lying in my familiar bed, staring up at the ceiling. Everything looks normal, peaceful, the kind of ordinary scene that once would have comforted me. But there's that light again, that soft, oval glow hovering above me, pulsing gently like a sleeping breath. And there's the hum, that frequency that resonates in my bones, and the voice speaking in patterns that have become as familiar as my own thoughts. I know this is just another dream. It has to be. The cycle always begins the same way, with that simple scene, that single impossible detail. I'll watch the light, listen to the voice, feel myself being lifted into that sphere of illumination. I'll learn more about their purpose, about my role in their research, and then I'll wake up back in this same bed with new marks on my arms and new gaps in my memory. But something's different this time, something small but significant. The leaf is back. The same leaf I swept into the bin that first morning, lying on the floor beside my bed, exactly where it was before, despite the window being closed, despite the room being sealed. But this leaf isn't wilted or brown like it should be after all this time. It's fresh, green, still glistening with dew. And it's warm to the touch. I pick it up and feel that familiar hum vibrating through its surface. The leaf pulses with the same rhythm as the light above me, the same rhythm as the marks on my arms. It's real in a way that nothing else in this dream has ever been real. Which means this isn't a dream anymore. The light grows brighter, the hum grows stronger, and the voice begins to speak. But I'm no longer listening to what it's saying. I'm staring at this impossible leaf, this fragment of something that shouldn't exist, this proof that everything I thought I knew about dreams and reality was wrong. The window is opening now, though there's no wind to move it. Cool air flows into the room, carrying that sharp scent of ozone and something else, something artificial and clean. The curtains don't move, hanging as still as ever, but I can feel the presence beyond the glass, waiting, patient, ready to continue the work they've been doing all along. I close my eyes and feel myself beginning to float, just like always. But this time I keep the leaf clutched in my hand. This time I have proof. This time I'll remember everything. Story 4. I sit here now staring at the final report on my desk, knowing I can never go back to that place. The words blur together as I read them for the 100th time. All items present and accounted for, they wrote. Temperature controls normal. No irregularities detected. But I know what I saw in those final moments, what I felt when I realized the truth about that room. My hands shake as I remember standing there among those endless shelves, watching the scanner's green light sweep across barcode after barcode. Each beep echoed in the silence, a mechanical heartbeat counting down to something I couldn't yet understand. The dust motes floated in the fluorescent glare, and I noticed how they seemed to move in patterns that defied the still air. That unopened delivery box sat by the entrance like a patient animal, its shipping label too faded to read clearly. The power indicator on the wall kept flickering in that same irregular rhythm I'd grown used to ignoring. 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 long ones, pause, repeat. I thought it was just old wiring then. I thought a lot of things were just normal wear and tear. But now I remember what happened just before I began that final inventory check. I remember standing in the hallway outside the storage room, my hand hovering over the door handle, feeling an inexplicable reluctance to enter. The motion sensors should have triggered the lights automatically, but they remained dark until I manually flipped the switch. The air vent's low hum seemed louder than usual, almost like breathing. I've been avoiding that room for days, I realize now. Making excuses, finding other tasks, sending junior staff to handle routine checks. Something in my subconscious had been warning me, but I dismissed it as stress from the busy season. When I finally forced myself to go in, everything appeared normal on the surface. The boxes sat in their designated places, the temperature gauge read exactly what it should, and the security camera's red recording light blinked steadily in the corner. It was only when I tried to review the footage later that I discovered those 2 missing minutes, looping endlessly like a scratched record. 2 minutes that should have shown me entering the room, but instead displayed the same empty corridor over and over. Going back further, I remember the first time I noticed something was wrong. It was during a routine delivery inspection, 3 weeks before that final inventory. The delivery driver seemed nervous, kept glancing at that same corner where the unopened box would later appear. He handed me the clipboard to sign, and his fingers were ice cold despite the warm weather outside. When I asked if he was feeling all right, he just shook his head and muttered something about the route taking longer than expected. "Strange cargo this time," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Company's been real specific about handling procedures, real specific." I signed the papers without thinking much about it. Drivers often complained about new regulations and shipping requirements, but I remember now how he backed away from the storage room door when I opened it to show him where to place the boxes. He wouldn't step inside, just set everything down in the threshold and quickly retreated to his truck. That night I stayed late to reorganize the new inventory. The building was empty except for the security guard making his rounds, but I kept hearing footsteps in the hallway outside. Soft, deliberate steps that would stop whenever I paused to listen. When I finally opened the door to check, the corridor was empty, stretching away under the dim emergency lighting like a throat waiting to swallow something. The air vent's hum had changed by then, I realized now. It had developed an almost musical quality, rising and falling in waves that seemed to match my breathing. I told myself it was just the building settling, the ductwork expanding and contracting, but deep down, some primitive part of my brain recognized it as something else entirely. I started having dreams around that time. Dreams where I walked through the storage room and found extra boxes that weren't on any manifest, boxes that felt warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. In these dreams, the barcodes would shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. But it was the temperature that first made me truly suspicious. Our system recorded every fluctuation, every degree of change, and the logs showed perfect consistency. Yet I could feel variations when I worked in that room, subtle shifts that made me shiver or sweat without explanation. The thermometer on the wall never moved, but my body knew something was wrong. I started checking the room more frequently, telling myself I was being thorough, professional. But really I was looking for evidence of what I couldn't quite name. The dust patterns began to fascinate me. They formed spirals in corners where no air current should have reached them, created geometric shapes that seemed too precise to be random. I took pictures with my phone, but they never captured what I saw with my naked eye. The security footage became my obsession. Hours of recorded emptiness, the same angles day after day, the same shadows falling in the same places. But occasionally, just at the edge of perception, I thought I saw movement. A box that seemed to have shifted slightly between frames, a shadow that fell differently than it should have, dust motes that danced in impossible formations. That's when I started staying later, watching the room through the security monitors instead of entering it directly. The night janitor complained about the lights being left on, but I needed to see what happened when no one was supposed to be there. The motion sensors never triggered, the temperature never changed, yet something was different each time I returned. I remember the night I first heard the sound from inside the boxes. Not all of them, just a few scattered throughout the room. A soft scratching, like fingernails on cardboard or small animals trying to claw their way out. But the boxes were sealed, their contents supposedly inorganic, industrial supplies that couldn't make noise. I opened one of the scratching boxes with trembling hands, expecting to find mice or insects that had somehow gotten inside. Instead, I found exactly what the manifest said should be there: metal components, cold and silent. Yet the scratching continued from somewhere else in the room, moving from box to box like a game of hide and seek. That's when I understood that whatever was happening had been building for much longer than I'd realized. Going back through my memory, I could trace the signs to the very beginning, to that first seemingly innocent delivery that had started everything. It was a small package, unremarkable in every way except for the fact that it had no corresponding order in our system. The delivery driver that day was different from our usual guy, older, with eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He spoke in a whisper, as if afraid of being overheard, and his hands shook as he handed me the clipboard. "Special handling," he said, pointing to the small box among the regular shipment. "Company says it goes in the back corner, away from everything else. Don't ask me why." I should have questioned it then, should have called the shipping company, verified the order, followed proper protocol. Instead, I simply carried the box to the storage room and placed it where he'd indicated, in that far corner where the dust would later form its impossible patterns. The box was heavier than it should have been for its size, and warm to the touch despite having been in a refrigerated truck. When I set it down, I could have sworn I felt it vibrate slightly, like a phone receiving a text message. But when I picked it up again to check, it was perfectly still. I never opened that first box. It sat in its corner, accumulating dust, while other deliveries came and went around it. But now I understand that it was the seed from which everything else grew. The source of the temperature fluctuations, the cause of the motion sensor failures, the reason why the security footage began to glitch and loop. That small, warm box had been waiting patiently in its corner, drawing the other packages to it like iron filings to a magnet. Each new delivery made the effects stronger, the anomalies more pronounced, until finally the room itself had become something other than what it appeared to be. And I realize now, as I sit here with the final report in my hands, that the box had been meant for me all along. The shipping label, too faded to read clearly by the time I thought to check it, had originally borne my name. Not the company's name, not the building's address, but my name specifically. Someone somewhere had known I would be the one to carry it into that storage room. Had known I would place it in that exact corner, had known I would ignore the warning signs until it was too late to matter. The scratching sound I heard from the boxes wasn't something trying to get out. It was something trying to get in. Story 5. I brushed the thin layer of dust from the tabletop and felt a chill run through my fingers. Each particle seemed to clamor for attention, betraying a presence that shouldn't have been. The creak of the wooden floor beneath me was only a shadow in my peripheral awareness. My skin rose with goosebumps as if the room exhaled a secret. The air tasted older, more muted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the dust carried stories I wasn't meant to hear. But that's just me being dramatic. Nothing really happened that night. I mean, there wasn't actually a night to speak of because I never went anywhere. I stayed home like I always do. I watched television and ate dinner and went to bed at a reasonable hour. That's what happened. That's all that happened. I didn't see anything unusual when I walked past the old building on Maple Street, because I didn't walk past any building. I took my usual route home, the one I've taken for months now, straight down the main road. No detours, no stops. Certainly no lingering outside that gray concrete structure with its windows that reflected nothing, even when the streetlights hit them at just the right angle. The door wasn't open. There was no door to be open, actually, because I never approached any building closely enough to notice details like that. But if there had been a door, it definitely wouldn't have been that particular shade of blue. Not that deep, almost navy color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And there certainly wasn't any sound coming from inside. No humming. No low vibration that you could feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. I must have been tired. That explains the strange thoughts I've been having. Work has been stressful lately, and when you're exhausted, your mind starts playing tricks on you. It starts inventing things that never happened, like the way the handle felt warm under my palm even though the metal should have been cold from the evening air. But I never touched any handle, so that's irrelevant. The hallway inside was probably just something I glimpsed in a movie once. That's why I can picture it so clearly, the way it stretched much further than the building's exterior suggested it should. The fluorescent lights overhead weren't flickering in any particular pattern. There was no pattern. There were no lights at all because I wasn't in any hallway. I was at home, making dinner, stirring pasta in a pot while steam rose from the boiling water. Maybe I dozed off on the couch and dreamed the whole thing. That would explain the voices I thought I heard. Not voices exactly, more like whispers, but not in any language I recognized. They seemed to be coming from behind doors that lined the hallway I definitely wasn't walking down. The doors were all identical, painted the same institutional white, each with a small window at eye level. I didn't look through any of those windows. I wouldn't have wanted to see what was behind them. It was probably just the neighbor's television that I heard. Sound travels strangely through these old apartment buildings. What I mistook for voices calling my name was likely just dialogue from some late-night show bleeding through the walls. There's a perfectly rational explanation for everything if you just think about it logically. The room at the end of the hall doesn't exist, obviously, because there was no hall. But if it did exist, it would have been completely ordinary. Just a regular room with regular walls and a regular ceiling. Not that strange, too bright white that hurt to look at directly. Not those walls that seemed to curve slightly, even though they appeared straight when you looked at them head-on. And definitely not that smell, like ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with something metallic and organic that made my throat feel tight. I never sat in that chair in the center of the room. How could I? I was at home the entire evening. I remember watching the news, learning about traffic delays and weather patterns. I remember brushing my teeth and putting on my pajamas. I have a clear recollection of my normal, boring routine. So the memory of that chair with its smooth surface that wasn't quite leather and wasn't quite plastic must be from somewhere else entirely. The people in the white coats were probably just doctors I saw in a commercial. That's why their faces seemed so familiar yet completely blank at the same time. They moved with that careful, practiced efficiency you see in medical dramas. Their shoes made no sound on the floor, which makes perfect sense because they weren't real. Neither were their instruments, those strange silver tools that caught the harsh overhead lighting and reflected it back in ways that made my eyes water. I didn't feel the needle going into my arm. There was no needle. There was no arm extended on a padded rest while someone in latex gloves found a vein with practiced ease. The pinch and burn of the injection site is just phantom pain, probably from sleeping wrong on my couch. And the way my vision started to blur around the edges, that was just fatigue catching up with me after a long day. The ceiling above the chair had tiles arranged in a perfect grid pattern. Each tile was identical, white with small perforations that formed no particular design but somehow seemed deliberate. I counted them while I lay there, not because I was lying anywhere, but because counting is something people do when they're bored or anxious. 64 tiles in total, arranged in an 8x8 square. Strange that I would remember such a specific detail about something that never happened. The questions they asked were probably just thoughts running through my own head. Do you remember arriving here? How did you find this place? What did you see before you came inside? Normal questions that anyone might ask themselves during a perfectly ordinary evening at home. The way they repeated each question, their voices layering over each other until the words lost all meaning, that was probably just my imagination filling in details for a story that doesn't exist. I told them I didn't remember anything because there was nothing to remember. I explained that I was just a regular person living a regular life, someone who minded their own business and never went looking for trouble. They seemed to find this amusing, though I couldn't see their expressions clearly. The lights were too bright, and everything kept swimming in and out of focus. The machine they wheeled in next to the chair was probably just medical equipment I've seen in movies. It had a screen that displayed green lines moving in wave patterns, and several dials that one of them adjusted while watching my face carefully. When they attached the small metal discs to my temples, the adhesive felt cold and slightly sticky. But that's just my brain inventing sensory details to make the dream seem more real. The electricity wasn't painful exactly. It was more like a deep vibration that started in my skull and spread outward through my whole body. My muscles tensed involuntarily and I could taste copper on my tongue. But pain is subjective, and since none of this actually happened, there was no pain to speak of. Just the memory of sensation, which is completely different. They asked me again about what I'd seen, what I remembered from before. The questions came faster now, overlapping and echoing in the bright white room that definitely doesn't exist. I tried to answer honestly, but my thoughts felt scattered, like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands. Every time I grasped for a memory, it slipped away and reformed into something else entirely. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew I was back in my apartment, sitting on my couch in the same clothes I'd been wearing earlier. The television was still on, playing some late-night infomercial about kitchen knives. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, which proves that I never went anywhere at all. The whole experience was obviously just a very vivid dream brought on by stress and too much caffeine. The small bandage on my arm was probably from bumping into something during the day. I'm always getting little scrapes and bruises without noticing exactly when or how. The adhesive was the same medical grade type they use in hospitals, but you can buy that kind of thing at any pharmacy. There's nothing suspicious about it. The dreams have been more frequent lately, but that's normal when you're under pressure at work. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the taste of metal in my mouth and the feeling that someone has been asking me questions. But dreams fade quickly, and by morning I can never quite remember what the questions were about. I've been avoiding Maple Street on my way home, but only because I discovered a more efficient route. It has nothing to do with the gray building or the way its windows seem to track your movement as you pass by. That's just an optical illusion caused by the angle of the glass and the position of the streetlights. Perfectly explainable. Sometimes I catch myself touching the spot on my arm where the bandage was, even though there's no mark there now. Skin heals quickly, especially from minor injuries that you barely notice when they happen. The slight tenderness is probably just from pressing on it too much, checking for something that was never there in the first place. I've been sleeping better lately, which is good. No more strange dreams about white rooms and people in coats asking questions I can't answer. No more waking up with the certainty that I've been somewhere else, somewhere I shouldn't have been. Just normal sleep, the kind that leaves you refreshed and ready for another ordinary day. The dust on my table has been accumulating again, despite my efforts to keep things clean. It seems to appear overnight sometimes, settling in patterns that almost look deliberate. But dust is just dust, made up of dead skin cells and fabric fibers and all the microscopic debris of daily life. There's nothing meaningful about the way it arranges itself. I've been thinking about taking a different job, maybe in another part of town. Not because of anything specific, just a general desire for change. It would be nice to have a completely fresh start, somewhere with no history or connections to complicate things. Somewhere the dreams might not follow me. The phone has been ringing more often lately, but when I answer, there's only silence on the other end. Probably just telemarketers with faulty equipment, or maybe kids playing pranks. I've started letting it go to voicemail, but the messages are always empty. Just the sound of breathing or maybe static. It's hard to tell the difference sometimes. Everything is perfectly normal now. I go to work, I come home, I eat dinner and watch television and go to bed at reasonable hours. I don't take walks past buildings that shouldn't exist, and I don't think about rooms with too bright lights or chairs that hold you too gently while strangers ask questions you can't answer. But sometimes, late at night when I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear that humming again. That low vibration that you feel more than hear, coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of awareness. And I know that soon, very soon, I'll need to take another walk down Maple Street just to prove to myself that there's nothing there worth remembering. Story 6. There was a time when I dismissed it as mere coincidence, something that existed in the periphery of my daily routine. Every morning while sipping my coffee, I'd notice a pair of shoes left outside the neighboring door, the same pair, side by side, always facing the same direction. Yet one day the left shoe was inexplicably turned at an angle. I shrugged it off at first, until it happened again, the same shoe, now slightly scuffed. Yesterday I noticed a new pair, but only one shoe was there. The other had vanished, leaving behind a hint of unease I can't quite shake. I've been thinking about that missing shoe for months now, because it reminds me of something else that disappeared. Something I haven't talked about with anyone, not my family, not the few friends I still keep in touch with. For years, I told myself it was better to forget, to let it settle into the quiet corners of my memory where uncomfortable things go to fade. But they don't fade, do they? They just wait there, patient as shadows, until something as simple as a misplaced shoe brings them rushing back. I'm ready to tell this story now. At least I think I am. My hands are shaking a little as I speak these words, but maybe that's normal. Maybe that's what happens when you finally decide to unlock a door you've kept sealed for so long. It happened during a time when my life felt perfectly ordinary. I was house sitting for someone who'd gone away for an extended period, taking care of their place while they traveled. The house was larger than anywhere I'd lived before, with rooms I rarely used and corners that seemed to collect shadows even during the brightest part of the day. But it was comfortable, quiet, and I was grateful for the solitude. I'd been going through a difficult period, the kind where you need space to think, to heal, to remember who you are when nobody else is watching. The neighborhood was suburban, tree-lined, the kind of place where people minded their own business and children rode bicycles in lazy circles until their mothers called them in for dinner. I established routines quickly: morning coffee on the back porch, afternoon walks around the block, evening reading in the living room with the television murmuring softly in the background. Simple rhythms that helped me feel grounded, connected to something normal and predictable. For the first few weeks, everything felt exactly as it should. I was sleeping better than I had in months. My appetite returned. I even started a small garden in the backyard, planting herbs and vegetables that would probably be harvested by someone else, but the act of nurturing something felt healing in ways I hadn't expected. But then I started noticing the hum. It was so subtle at first that I convinced myself it was just the refrigerator cycling on and off, or maybe the air conditioning unit outside. A low, steady tone that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, barely audible unless I was sitting very still. I only noticed it during the quiet hours, usually late at night when the neighborhood had settled into sleep and the house felt most like a living thing around me. The hum had a strange quality to it. It wasn't mechanical, not exactly. It was more organic, like the sound of breathing through water, or the way your ears ring after exposure to loud music, except it wasn't coming from inside my head. It was definitely external, definitely real, but when I tried to locate its source, moving from room to room with my ear pressed to walls, it seemed to shift and dance just beyond my ability to pin it down. I called the homeowner to ask about it, but they seemed genuinely puzzled. They'd never noticed any unusual sounds, they said. Maybe it was seasonal, something to do with the heating system or the way the house settled during temperature changes. Their casual dismissal should have reassured me, but instead it left me feeling oddly isolated, as if I was experiencing something that existed only for me. The hum began to change after a few days. The frequency would shift slightly, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, like someone slowly turning a dial on an old radio, and it started appearing at different times of day. I'd be washing dishes and suddenly become aware of it rising from somewhere beneath the kitchen floor. Or I'd be reading in bed and feel it vibrating through the mattress, so faint I wondered if I was imagining it, but persistent enough that I'd find myself holding my breath, listening, waiting for it to either intensify or fade away. Sleep became more difficult, not because the sound was loud, but because it was constant, and once I became aware of it, I couldn't stop listening for it. I'd lie in bed, my body tired but my mind alert, tracking the subtle variations in tone and wondering what could possibly be causing such a thing. I started sleeping with earplugs, but that only made it worse. The hum seemed to bypass my ears entirely and vibrate directly through my bones. During this time, I also began noticing problems with the electronic devices in the house. The television would change channels on its own, cycling through static-filled stations that didn't seem to exist when I tried to find them manually. The microwave clock would reset itself to random times, and I'd discover it blinking 3, 33 or 11, 47 even though I'd set it correctly just hours before. The coffee maker started brewing at odd hours, filling the kitchen with the rich smell of fresh coffee at 2 in the morning, or during the middle of the afternoon when I hadn't programmed it to do anything. I told myself these were just quirks of older appliances, the kind of minor malfunctions that happen in any house. I unplugged things when I wasn't using them, thinking maybe there were power surges or electrical issues I didn't understand, but the problems persisted and they seemed to be getting more frequent, more deliberate. The morning I found every clock in the house displaying the same incorrect time, I felt the first real chill of fear. Not just confusion or annoyance, but genuine fear, because it wasn't random anymore. Every digital display, from the microwave to the cable box to the alarm clock beside the bed, showed 4:44. When I checked my phone, it displayed the correct time, but all the house's clocks had synchronized themselves to this impossible moment that had never actually occurred. I reset them all one by one, but the next morning they'd done it again. This time it was 2:22. The following day, 5:55. Always the repeated digits, always perfectly synchronized, as if something was using the displays to communicate in a language I didn't understand but somehow found deeply unsettling. The hum grew stronger during this period. It was no longer something I had to strain to hear. It filled the house like a presence, rising and falling with its own mysterious rhythm. Sometimes it would stop abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt oppressive, and I'd find myself waiting, almost hoping for it to return, because the absence was somehow worse than the sound itself. I started spending more time outside, taking longer walks, finding excuses to run errands that kept me away from the house during the day. But even when I was gone, I could feel it waiting for me. The thought of returning home began to fill me with a dread I couldn't rationally explain. Nothing had actually threatened me. Nothing had caused me any physical harm, but the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like something that was studying me, learning my patterns, my habits, my fears. The mirrors started reflecting things incorrectly around this time. Not dramatically, not in ways that anyone else would probably notice, but I'd catch glimpses of movement that didn't match my own actions. I'd raise my left hand and see my reflection raise its right. I'd turn to the left and watch my reflection turn to the right. The discrepancies were small, barely perceptible, but once I started noticing them, I couldn't stop. Every reflective surface in the house became a source of anxiety. I found myself avoiding the bathroom mirror, covering the television screen when it was turned off, walking quickly past the windows at night when they showed my reflection against the darkness outside. The sweet metallic smell appeared during the 4th week. It would drift through the house at unpredictable times, strongest in rooms I hadn't been in for hours. Not unpleasant exactly, but wrong somehow, like the scent of copper pennies mixed with something floral and cloying. I searched for its source obsessively, checking for gas leaks, rotting food, dead animals in the walls, anything that might explain such an unusual odor. But it would vanish as suddenly as it appeared, leaving me standing in empty rooms, breathing deeply, wondering if I was losing my mind. My body began reacting in ways I couldn't control. I'd get goosebumps for no reason, sudden waves of them that would sweep across my arms and neck while I was sitting in perfectly comfortable temperatures. My chest would tighten whenever I was near electronic devices, a pressure that felt like someone pressing their palm against my sternum. I'd find myself holding my breath without realizing it, or breathing too quickly, as if the air in the house had become thinner, less nourishing. Sleep was nearly impossible by then. When I did manage to drift off, I'd wake up feeling like I'd been watched all night. not dreaming about being watched, but actually experiencing the sensation of eyes on me. Attention focused on me with an intensity that left me feeling exposed and vulnerable even under layers of blankets. I started sleeping in different rooms, thinking maybe the bedroom had some quality that was making me paranoid, but the feeling followed me wherever I went. The key moment came on a night when the hum suddenly stopped. I'd grown so accustomed to it that the silence woke me immediately. I sat up in bed, listening to nothing, and for the first time in weeks the house felt completely quiet. No vibrations through the walls, no subtle frequencies dancing at the edge of my hearing, just pure, clean silence. But then I heard something else, footsteps. Not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable. Someone was walking through the house, moving slowly from room to room with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who knew the layout well. I held my breath and listened, tracking the sound as it moved through the living room, into the kitchen, down the hallway toward where I was hiding under the covers like a frightened child. I knew I was alone in the house. I'd locked all the doors, checked all the windows. There was no way someone could have entered without me hearing them. But the footsteps were real, accompanied by the subtle creaking of floorboards, the soft whisper of movement through space. They stopped right outside my door. I waited, my heart hammering so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Minutes passed. The silence stretched on, but I could feel presence on the other side of the door, something waiting with infinite patience for me to make the next move. I never opened that door. I lay in bed until dawn, listening, waiting, afraid to move or breathe too loudly. When morning finally came and sunlight began filtering through the windows, I heard the footsteps retreat, moving back through the house with that same measured pace, until they faded entirely and the familiar hum resumed its low, constant song. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the house's history, the neighborhood, anything that might explain what was happening to me. I found nothing unusual. No reports of strange phenomena, no tragic deaths, no history of previous tenants experiencing similar problems. Just a normal house in a normal neighborhood with nothing in its past that should have been causing such disturbances. But I couldn't stay there anymore. The footsteps had changed something fundamental about my relationship with that space. It was no longer just uncomfortable or unsettling. It felt actively malevolent, like something that had been toying with me was now ready to reveal its true nature. I packed my things that afternoon and left a note for the homeowner, claiming a family emergency required me to leave immediately. I didn't explain about the hum or the mirrors or the footsteps. How could I? Who would believe such a story? I could barely believe it myself, and I'd lived through every moment of it. The drive away from that neighborhood should have felt like liberation, but it didn't. As I watched the house disappear in my rearview mirror, I felt like I was leaving part of myself behind, some essential piece that had been claimed by whatever lived in those walls. The further I drove, the more I realized that distance wasn't going to solve anything. Whatever had happened to me there, it had become part of me. I've been living in a different place now for months, but I'm not the same person who first walked into that house looking for peace and solitude. My sleep is still fractured, full of dreams where I'm walking through rooms that hum with invisible energy. I wake up with the taste of metal in my mouth and the smell of that sweet, cloying odor clinging to my clothes. Electronic devices still behave strangely around me. My phone will dial numbers I've never seen before, connecting me to static-filled lines where I can sometimes hear what sounds like breathing. The television in my current apartment changes channels when I'm not looking, always landing on stations that show nothing but empty rooms filmed from security cameras, rooms that look disturbingly similar to the ones I left behind. But the worst part is the feeling that I'm still being watched, not just occasionally, not just when I'm alone in dark rooms, but constantly. Something followed me when I left that house, or maybe something was planted inside me during those weeks of slow, careful observation. I feel it in crowded restaurants, in busy shopping centers, in the middle of conversations with friends who have no idea that I'm only half present. That part of me is always listening for that familiar hum, always bracing for the next sign that my invisible companion is still with me. I thought telling this story might help, might somehow break the connection between me and whatever I encountered in that place. But as I speak these words, I can feel the pressure building in my chest again, the same tightness I felt whenever I was near electronic devices in that house. The air in this room is starting to smell faintly metallic, faintly sweet. And I'm beginning to realize that some experiences don't end just because you leave them behind. Some things attach themselves to you so completely that distance becomes meaningless. I may have escaped that house, but I don't think I'll ever escape what found me there. The hum is starting again, so faint I might be imagining it, but growing stronger with each word I speak. I think it's been waiting for me to tell this story, waiting for me to acknowledge what happened, to give it permission to fully manifest in this new space I thought was safe. I should stop talking now, but I'm afraid that stopping won't make any difference. I'm afraid that it's already too late, that by finally speaking these words aloud, I've completed some kind of circuit I didn't know I was building. The recording equipment is starting to malfunction, the levels jumping erratically, and I can see my reflection in the dark window across the room doing things I'm not doing, moving in ways that don't match my actual movements. I wanted to warn someone to leave behind some record of what happened to me, but I'm starting to think that was never really my choice to make. I think I was always meant to tell this story, meant to speak these words into whatever device is capturing them, meant to pass along something that was never really mine to keep. If you're listening to this, I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. But I don't think I'm alone anymore, and I don't think I ever will be again. Story 7. It was the scent of overripe oranges that greeted me, clinging to the air in the hallway. Sweet, almost intoxicating, yet distinctly out of place in a house that hadn't seen fresh fruit in weeks. I hesitated at the threshold, the unexpected aroma unraveling a string of memories I had long secured away. The walls seemed to lean in as if drawn by my confusion, and for a moment the hallway appeared narrower, tighter. I moved forward, drawn by a compulsion to find the source. The air grew dense with the scent, each step thickening the atmosphere. I remembered that smell from another house, another time, when the past felt like it could be rewritten. I shouldn't have followed it, but I did. That was how it started, I think, or maybe it began in the dream. The first dream where everything felt normal except for that one small thing. A light in the corner of my vision, steady and oval-shaped, like an eye that never blinked. I was lying in my bed, or what I thought was my bed, and the room felt familiar in that way dreams make everything familiar, even when nothing quite matches reality. The light pulsed once, twice, a gentle rhythm like breathing. I tried to turn my head to look at it directly, but my neck wouldn't move. My body felt heavy, settled deep into the mattress as if I'd been lying there for hours. The light continued its quiet pulsing, and somewhere in the distance I could hear a sound, a hum low and constant, like electricity running through old wires. When I woke up, I dismissed it, stress probably. Work had been demanding, and my sleep schedule was all wrong. Everyone has strange dreams sometimes. The mind processes things in odd ways when you're tired. But the smell of oranges lingered in my nose for the rest of the morning. The second time the dream lasted longer. I was in the same position, flat on my back, unable to move. The oval light was there again, but now it seemed closer, hovering somewhere above me. The humming sound was clearer too, not just electricity, but something more complex, like a voice trying to form words through static. I could feel my heartbeat against my ribs, slow and steady, but there was something else. A sensation of being lifted, though no part of my body actually moved. Just the feeling of weightlessness, of floating while remaining perfectly still. The light pulsed in sync with my breathing. That's when I noticed the scent, sharp and clean, like the air after a thunderstorm, but artificial somehow. Ozone maybe, but too pure, too deliberate. It filled my lungs with each breath, and I found myself trying to place where I'd smelled it before. The voice in the static grew clearer, though I still couldn't make out words. It sounded patient, like someone waiting for me to understand something important. I woke up with the taste of metal on my tongue. The next few days I started noticing things, small things. My coffee mug was on the wrong side of the sink when I came downstairs. The book I'd been reading was open to a page I didn't remember reaching. My phone showed missed calls from numbers that didn't exist when I tried to call them back. And there were marks on my arm, 3 small indentations, perfectly round, arranged in a triangle just below my elbow. They didn't hurt, but they were definitely there, pressed into my skin like someone had held me very gently but very firmly. I told myself I must have done it in my sleep. People do strange things when they're unconscious. Scratch themselves, move around, knock things over. It was nothing unusual. But the marks were so precise. The third dream was different, vivid in a way that made waking life feel pale and distant. I was in the same position, but now I could see more of the room around me. It wasn't my bedroom at all. The walls were smooth and curved, almost organic, like being inside something alive. The oval light wasn't just hovering anymore. It was moving, drifting in slow circles above me, and I could see that it wasn't a light at all, but an opening. A window, maybe, looking out into something vast and dark. The humming had become a voice, clear and metallic, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was telling me not to be afraid, that this was necessary, that I had agreed to this, though I couldn't remember when or why. My body felt different too, lighter, more fluid, as if I were made of something softer than flesh and bone. When I tried to move my hand, it responded, but slowly, like moving through thick water. The sensation of being lifted was stronger now, and I could feel myself rising toward the oval opening above. The voice continued its patient explanation, and I found myself nodding, accepting whatever it was telling me. This was right. This was supposed to happen. I had always known it would happen, somewhere deep in my mind where forgotten things waited to be remembered. Through the opening I could see stars, but they were arranged wrong, forming patterns I didn't recognize. Beautiful patterns that made perfect sense even though I'd never seen them before. When I woke up, it was afternoon, and I had no memory of the morning. That's when the dreams started bleeding through. I would be sitting at my desk working and suddenly hear that humming sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere behind the walls. When I got up to investigate, it would stop, leaving only the ordinary sounds of the house settling and the refrigerator cycling on and off. The smell of ozone would drift through rooms with no windows open, no storms in the forecast. I would catch glimpses of oval lights in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there would be nothing there except the familiar shadows of furniture and doorways. Time became unreliable. I would sit down to eat lunch and look up to find the sun setting. Or I would go to bed exhausted and wake up feeling like I'd only closed my eyes for a moment, though the light outside suggested hours had passed. My reflection started looking strange to me, not different exactly, but unfamiliar, like seeing a photograph of yourself taken from an angle you've never noticed before. I would catch myself staring in the bathroom mirror, trying to remember what I used to look like, but the memory would slip away before I could grasp it. The marks on my arm faded, but new ones appeared, always small, always precise, always in places I couldn't have reached myself. I stopped trying to explain them. Other people began to seem distant, their voices coming from far away even when they were standing right next to me. Conversations felt scripted, like everyone was reading from the same play, and I was the only one who had forgotten my lines. I started to suspect that the dreams weren't dreams at all. Maybe they were memories surfacing from some deep place in my mind where they had been carefully stored away. Maybe someone had wanted me to forget, had helped me forget, but the forgetting was wearing thin. The thought didn't frighten me as much as it should have. Instead, it felt like relief, like finally understanding a joke everyone else had been laughing at. Of course, these weren't dreams. Of course, something had happened to me, something I had agreed to and then been allowed to forget until it was time to remember again. The voice in the static had been patient because it knew I would understand eventually. It had been waiting for me to be ready. I was almost ready now. The fourth dream or memory or whatever it was showed me the rest of the room. The curved walls were lined with panels that glowed softly, displaying symbols that shifted and changed as I watched. The air was filled with that clean, artificial scent, and I could hear other voices now, distant but harmonious, like a choir singing in frequencies just beyond human hearing. I was no longer alone on the table or bed or whatever I had been lying on. There were others arranged in a circle around me, all floating in the same gentle way, all facing the oval opening above. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I recognized them somehow. We had done this before, many times. It was a ritual or maybe just a routine, something we participated in willingly because it was important. The metallic voice explained that we were being prepared, that our minds were being expanded, our memories carefully curated to help us function in both worlds. The forgetting was temporary, a kindness that allowed us to live normal lives between visits. But now it was time to remember everything. The stars through the opening rearranged themselves into new patterns, and I understood that they weren't stars at all, but lights on a vast ceiling, a sky that belonged to somewhere else entirely. Somewhere I had been before and would go again, because this was where I truly belonged. The others around me began to stir, their own memories returning, and I felt a sense of homecoming so profound it made me weep with joy. When I woke up, I was lying in my hallway, still in my pajamas, with the scent of overripe oranges heavy in the air around me. The forgetting was almost over now. I could feel the memories pressing against the inside of my skull, demanding to be acknowledged. Every mundane moment of my ordinary life felt like a costume I was wearing, a role I was playing until it was time to return to my real existence. The humming was constant now, a background soundtrack that followed me through my days. Other people couldn't hear it, but I had stopped expecting them to. They weren't like me. They didn't have the marks on their arms or the taste of metal on their tongues or the knowledge that somewhere above them, patient voices were calling them home. I started leaving my windows open at night, even though the weather was getting cold. I wanted to make it easier for them to find me when they came back. Because they would come back, they always did. The oval light appeared in my bedroom now, not just in dreams, but in the quiet moments before sleep, hovering near the ceiling like a gentle eye watching over me. I would lie still and let it pulse in rhythm with my breathing, feeling that familiar sensation of weightlessness, of being lifted toward something wonderful and strange. Sometimes I could hear the others, the ones who had been in the circle with me. Their voices drifted through the walls of my house, calling my name in languages I was starting to remember. It was almost time. The final dream began the same way they all had. I was lying on my back, unable to move, with the oval light pulsing gently above me. But this time I wasn't in the curved room or even in my own bedroom. I was back in the hallway where I had woken up, surrounded by the thick scent of overripe oranges. The light was closer now, close enough that I could see it wasn't an opening or a window, but something alive, something that had been watching me with infinite patience while I slowly remembered who I really was. The metallic voice spoke directly into my mind, welcoming me back, telling me that the preparation was complete. I had lived the life I needed to live, learned the things I needed to learn, and now it was time to return to my real purpose. I felt myself being lifted, not just the sensation this time, but actual movement, my body rising toward the light with a sense of rightness that made everything else in my life seem like a faded photograph. The others were there too, the ones from the circle, all of us ascending together toward the patient light that had been waiting for us to remember. As I passed through the oval opening, I looked back one last time at the hallway below, at the small, ordinary life I was leaving behind. It had served its purpose, but it had never been real, not in the way this was real. The scent of oranges faded, replaced by that clean, artificial smell of ozone and possibility. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my bed, morning light streaming through the windows. Everything looked normal, familiar, like any other day in my ordinary life. But there on the nightstand beside me was a single orange, perfectly ripe, still warm from some impossible tree. I had never bought oranges. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my palm, and knew with absolute certainty that I was not dreaming anymore. Story 8. I mentioned I'd only stayed on the ground floor, that the rain had kept me near the entrance, away from anything more. They seemed satisfied, jotting notes in rhythm with the drizzle outside, yet the damp scent of old wood lingered on my fingertips, stubborn and telling. The stairs had creaked a note that still echoed in my mind, carrying the weight of untold steps. A slight draft brushed my cheek with the chill of an unwelcome memory. The hallway light flickered, casting shadows that knew my path. I didn't mention the door half ajar or the coat beside it, but the mud was drying on my shoes. The lie came so naturally that I almost believed it myself. Almost, but lies have a way of clinging to you like smoke, seeping into your clothes, your skin, your breath. They asked if I'd seen anything unusual, and I shook my head with practiced innocence. The bandage on my palm was small, barely noticeable, but it pulled tight when I flexed my fingers. A paper cut, I'd said earlier, nothing more. But paper doesn't usually draw blood that dark. The room felt smaller now, with their questions pressing against the walls. I kept my hands folded, hiding the faint stains beneath my nails. The fluorescent light above hummed a tune that reminded me of something else, something that made my chest tighten. When they finally closed their notebooks and stood to leave, I felt the weight of their footsteps echoing in reverse, pulling me backward through the hours that had led to this moment. The silence that followed their departure was thick, pregnant with the memory of what I'd left unsaid. Before the questions, before the notebooks and the careful lies, I'd sat in my kitchen staring at my reflection in the window. The rain had stopped by then, leaving only the steady drip from the gutters and the occasional car passing on wet asphalt. My hands were clean, I'd made sure of that, but the soap hadn't quite erased the feeling of what they'd touched. The house felt different when I'd returned, not wrong exactly, but changed. Like furniture moved just an inch from where it belonged, creating a subtle discord that only I would notice. I'd made coffee, going through the motions of normalcy, but the cup sat cooling on the counter while I stood frozen by the sink. The water ran longer than it needed to, washing away traces of earth and something else I didn't want to name. My reflection in the kitchen window showed someone I recognized but didn't quite know. The same face, the same tired eyes, but there was something new there. A knowledge that sat heavy behind my pupils, changing the way light entered and left them. I'd touched my cheek, surprised by how cold my fingers were, and noticed how my hand trembled just slightly. The phone had rung once while I stood there, but I'd let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready for voices yet, for the pretense of conversation. The machine clicked and hummed, recording empty air before falling silent again. Later, I'd discover there was no message, just the sound of someone breathing softly before hanging up. But that was still to come. In that moment, I was simply a person standing in a kitchen, trying to remember how to be normal. The walk back had been longer than expected. My shoes squelched with each step, the mud sucking at the soles like it didn't want to let me go. The rain had turned the path into something treacherous, and I'd slipped twice, catching myself against trees that left their bark embedded under my fingernails. The forest seemed denser on the return journey, the spaces between trunks narrower, as if the woods themselves were closing ranks behind me. I'd kept looking over my shoulder, not because I expected to see anything, but because the feeling of being watched had grown stronger with each step away from that place. The sensation crawled up my spine like cold fingers, making me hunch my shoulders against more than just the weather. Every branch that snapped underfoot sounded too loud, every bird call too sharp. The path that had seemed so clear on the way in now branched and forked in ways I didn't remember. I'd taken what I thought was the right turn, then another, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed the same, their bark dark with moisture, their branches reaching across the path like gnarled fingers trying to hold me back or pull me deeper. When I finally found the main trail, the relief was so intense it made my knees weak. But even then, even with the safety of the marked path beneath my feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following just beyond the edge of my vision. Something that matched my pace, step for step, but never quite revealed itself. The rain had started as I'd reached the tree line, fat drops that struck my shoulders like small, cold hands. Inside, the house had felt different immediately. Not abandoned, that wasn't quite right, more like paused, as if someone had been there moments before and had simply stepped out of sight. The air was still and heavy, carrying scents that didn't belong, damp earth, something metallic, and underneath it all, a sweetness that made my stomach turn. I'd called out, my voice echoing strangely in the empty rooms. The sound came back wrong, flattened and absorbed by walls that seemed too eager to swallow it. No answer came, but I hadn't really expected one. The silence that followed was complete, so total that it felt like a presence itself, watching and waiting. The living room was exactly as I'd imagined it would be, furniture covered in sheets, dust motes dancing in the filtered light from dirty windows. But there were signs of recent disturbance, footprints in the dust, too large to be mine. A glass on the mantel that held the ghost of something that had evaporated, leaving only a ring of residue at the bottom. The stairs had beckoned from the hallway, their wooden steps worn smooth by decades of use. I'd known I should leave then, should turn around and walk back the way I'd come. But the pull was too strong, the need to see what lay above too insistent to ignore. Each step had groaned under my weight, the sound carrying up into the darkness like an announcement of my arrival. The banister was smooth beneath my palm, polished by countless hands that had gripped it before mine. Some of those hands, I realized with a chill, might have been there recently. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar. The air was thicker here, weighted with dust and time and something else that made my skin crawl. I'd chosen the door at the end of the hall, drawn by a thin line of light that leaked from beneath it. The room beyond had been a study once, lined with empty bookshelves and dominated by a desk that faced the single window. Papers were scattered across its surface not randomly, but arranged with deliberate care. I'd approached slowly, my footsteps muffled by a carpet that had once been red but was now the color of dried blood. The papers were covered in handwriting I didn't recognize, but the words were familiar. My name appeared again and again, surrounded by dates and locations, observations written in a careful, measured script. Someone had been watching me, documenting my movements, my habits, my routines. The most recent entry was dated that very morning. I'd backed away from the desk, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the damage was done. The knowledge was inside me now, spreading like poison through my veins. Someone knew me, had been studying me, preparing for this moment when I would finally come to this place. The sound of the front door closing had echoed up the stairs like a gunshot. The key had been exactly where they'd said it would be, under the third loose stone in the garden wall. My fingers had closed around it with a certainty that felt rehearsed, as if I'd done this before in dreams I couldn't quite remember. The metal was warm despite the cool air, and it fit the lock with a smoothness that suggested recent use. I'd stood on the threshold for a long moment, key in hand, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on my shoulders. The house loomed above me, its windows dark and empty, but somehow expectant, like eyes that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment, for me to finally arrive and complete whatever had been set in motion. The address had been written on a slip of paper that I'd found in my pocket that morning, though I had no memory of putting it there. The handwriting was mine, I was sure of it, but the words felt foreign, like something I'd written in a fevered dream. The paper was soft with age, as if it had been carried for a long time, waiting for the right moment to be discovered. The walk through the neighborhood had been strange, familiar yet wrong. Streets I'd never seen before felt like paths I'd walked 1,000 times. Houses with their neat lawns and drawn curtains seemed to watch my progress with hidden eyes. Children's toys abandoned on porches looked somehow sinister in the gray light, their bright colors muted and wrong. But I'd known the way without consulting the address. My feet had carried me along the correct route with an assurance that bypassed conscious thought. Left at the corner with the broken street light, right past the house with the overgrown hedge, straight until the pavement gave way to gravel and the suburban order dissolved into something wilder. The house had appeared through the trees like something from a half-remembered nightmare, all weathered wood and broken shutters. But it was the rightness of it that had made my blood run cold. This was exactly where I was supposed to be. The morning had begun with the phone call. I'd been making breakfast, going through the familiar routine of coffee and toast, when the shrill ring had cut through the domestic quiet like a blade. I'd answered without thinking, lifting the receiver to my ear with the automatic response of someone expecting good news. The voice on the other end was my own. Not similar to mine, not reminiscent of how I sounded on recordings, It was exactly my voice, speaking words I wasn't saying, breathing in rhythm with my own breath. The conversation was brief, businesslike, instructions delivered with calm efficiency, directions to a place I'd never heard of, a time I was expected to arrive. I'd tried to speak, to ask questions, to demand explanations, but my throat had closed around the words. My voice continued without pause, as if it had expected my silence. When it finished, the line went dead, leaving me standing in my kitchen with the receiver pressed to my ear and the taste of copper in my mouth. The slip of paper with the address had appeared on my counter while I'd stood there, frozen. I was certain it hadn't been there before, but there it was, written in my handwriting, in ink that was still wet enough to smudge when I touched it. I'd set the receiver back in its cradle with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped it. But even as fear crawled up my spine like ice water, I was already reaching for my jacket, already planning the route I would take, because deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine too closely, I knew I would go. I'd known this call would come eventually. I'd been waiting for it without realizing I was waiting, carrying the expectation like a seed that had finally found the right conditions to sprout. The dreams had been building for weeks before that morning, each one more vivid than the last. Always the same sequence, the phone ringing, the voice that was mine but wasn't, the address that led to a house I'd never seen but somehow knew intimately. I'd wake with the taste of old wood in my mouth and the feeling of mud between my toes, though my feet were clean and my bedroom carpet was spotless. At first, I dismissed them as stressed dreams, the product of too much coffee and too little sleep. But they'd grown more insistent, more detailed, until I could recite the address from memory and describe every room in a house I'd never visited. The voice had become clearer too, more distinct, until I could hear the subtle differences that marked it as something other than my own reflection. There was a hunger in it, a need that made my skin crawl even in sleep. It wanted something from me, something I possessed but didn't understand. The dreams always ended the same way, with me standing in front of a door, key in hand, knowing that once I opened it, there would be no going back. I'd started avoiding sleep, drinking coffee late into the evening and finding excuses to stay awake. But exhaustion always won eventually, and the dreams would return, stronger and more insistent than before. They'd begun to bleed into my waking hours, flashes of that other voice speaking just at the edge of hearing, glimpses of unfamiliar rooms reflected in windows and mirrors. The morning of the call, I'd woken with the certainty that the waiting was almost over. The air in my bedroom felt different, charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. I'd dressed with unusual care, choosing clothes that seemed appropriate for something I couldn't name, and had made breakfast with the methodical precision of someone performing a ritual. When the phone rang, I'd felt relief as much as terror. Finally, the pretense could end. But even then, even with the dreams and the growing certainty, I hadn't understood the true nature of what was happening. That knowledge would only come later, in a house that existed at the intersection of memory and nightmare, where the distinction between self and other had grown dangerously thin. The first time I'd heard my own voice speaking words I wasn't saying had been months ago, so subtle I'd almost missed it. I'd been alone in my apartment, reading by the window, when I'd heard someone humming in the kitchen. The melody was one I knew, one I often hummed without thinking, but I was sitting perfectly still, my mouth closed, my throat silent. I dismissed it as imagination, the kind of auditory trick the mind plays when it's too quiet for too long. But it had happened again and again, always when I was alone, always just familiar enough to be unsettling. My voice, but not quite. My words, but spoken with an inflection I didn't recognize. The incidents had grown more frequent, more bold. I'd hear conversations I wasn't having, phone calls I wasn't making, laughter that bubbled up from somewhere other than my throat. The voice was learning, adapting, becoming more precise in its mimicry. But there were always small differences, subtle wrongnesses that marked it as an imposter. It had started making plans without consulting me, commitments I'd discover only when friends called to confirm arrangements I didn't remember making. Appointments would appear in my calendar written in my handwriting, but in a style I didn't recognize. Books would be bookmarked at pages I'd never read, marked with notes in my own hand that expressed thoughts I'd never had. I'd begun to doubt my own memory, to question the reliability of my own experiences. Maybe I was having conversations and forgetting them. Maybe the stress of daily life had finally caught up with me, creating gaps in my consciousness that I was filling with paranoid fantasies. But deep down, I'd known the truth. Something was using my voice, wearing my identity like an ill-fitting coat. And with each passing incident, it was getting better at the impersonation, more confident in its theft of myself. The realization had come gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape I'd been too afraid to examine in full light. I wasn't losing my mind. I was losing myself to something that wanted to be me more than I did. The mirror had been the first sign, though I hadn't recognized it as such at the time. I'd been brushing my teeth before bed, going through the automatic motions of the bedtime routine, when I'd noticed my reflection pause for just a moment too long. Not freeze exactly, but hesitate, as if it were considering something I wasn't thinking about. I'd stopped moving, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, and watched my reflection continue the motion I'd abandoned. For just a second, maybe two, we were out of sync, my reflection and I, moving to different rhythms, following different impulses. Then it had snapped back into alignment, and I'd convinced myself it was fatigue, eye strain, the fluorescent light playing tricks on my vision. But I'd avoided that mirror for the rest of the week, brushing my teeth at the kitchen sink instead, telling myself it was more convenient. The photographs had been next, pictures of me at places I'd never been, doing things I'd never done, but looking perfectly natural, perfectly happy. They'd appeared mixed in with my regular photos, printed on the same paper in the same style as if they belonged there. In them I was always alone, always smiling, always looking directly at the camera with an expression I'd never seen on my own face. I'd found them scattered throughout my apartment, tucked into books, slipped between bills, taped to the inside of cabinet doors. Each one showed me living a life I didn't recognize, making memories I'd never formed. The person in the photographs looked like me in every detail, but there was something in the eyes that was fundamentally foreign. When I'd tried to throw them away, I'd found them back in their hiding places the next morning, as if they'd simply returned to where they belonged. Eventually, I'd stopped trying to dispose of them and had started avoiding the places where I knew they were hidden. But I couldn't avoid all the mirrors, couldn't ignore all the photographs. And slowly, reluctantly, I'd begun to accept that something was sharing my reflection, my image, my space in the world. Something that looked exactly like me but wanted different things, made different choices, lived a different life. The morning I'd found my own handwriting in a journal I'd never kept, describing days I'd never lived and thoughts I'd never had, I'd finally understood the scope of what was happening. I wasn't being haunted, I was being replaced. Story 9. The notification light didn't blink. My fingers brushed the screen, seeking the familiar vibration, but it remained inert, unresponsive. The chair creaked under my weight without the usual reassuring groan, as though it too held its breath. The room drew in closer, the quiet pressing at the edges, and when I expected the distant hum of distant traffic, there was only a void. I focused on the wallpaper's pattern, each line and swirl pretending, as if any moment they might shift and betray their true design. The absence filled the space, tangible, as if daring me to acknowledge what had ceased to exist. I woke from the first dream believing it was just stress. Work had been demanding, the kind of pressure that builds in your shoulders and settles behind your eyes like fog. In the dream, I was lying in my bed, but the ceiling seemed higher than usual. There was a soft light coming from somewhere above me, oval-shaped and steady, not quite like moonlight filtering through curtains. It pulsed gently, like breathing. The strangest part was the silence underneath it all. A silence so complete it felt heavy against my eardrums. When I actually woke up, I dismissed it immediately. The ceiling looked normal, the familiar water stain in the corner exactly where it had always been. I made coffee and went about my morning routine, but throughout the day, I found myself glancing upward more than usual, as though expecting to see that gentle, breathing light again. The second dream came 3 nights later, and it lingered longer this time. I was in the same position, lying on my back, but now I could feel the sheets beneath me more clearly than I'd ever felt them in waking life. The fabric had a strange texture, smoother somehow, almost synthetic. That oval light was there again, pulsing with the same rhythm, but now there was something else. A sound, barely audible, like someone adjusting a radio frequency. Static mixed with something that might have been a voice, but the words dissolved before I could grasp them. I felt myself being lifted, though no part of my body actually moved. It was as if the sensation of rising existed separately from my physical form. The air around me had a sharp scent like ozone after a storm, but cleaner, more artificial. I tried to turn my head to look around, but my neck wouldn't respond. The metallic voice grew slightly clearer, though I still couldn't make out what it was saying. It sounded patient, methodical, like someone reading from a list. This dream lasted much longer than the first. I remember thinking, even while dreaming, that I should be waking up by now. But the oval light continued its gentle pulsing, and the voice continued its indecipherable recitation, and I remained suspended in that strange state of motionless motion. When I finally woke, my sheets were damp with sweat, and there was a metallic taste in my mouth that lingered through breakfast. It was during the following week that I began noticing things in my waking life that seemed pulled directly from the dreams. Small things at first. I found my bedsheets folded differently than I remembered folding them, with crisp edges that I'd never been able to achieve. The fabric felt different too, smoother against my skin, though when I examined them closely in daylight, they looked exactly the same as always. My phone started acting strangely. The screen would flicker occasionally, displaying interference patterns that resembled television static. The repair shop couldn't find anything wrong with it. They ran diagnostics, replaced the screen, even gave me a loaner device, but the same patterns appeared within days. The technician shrugged and suggested electromagnetic interference from nearby equipment, though I couldn't think of any new electronics in my vicinity. I discovered a small mark on my forearm one morning while showering, a tiny puncture that I couldn't remember getting. It was perfectly round, almost surgical in its precision. I tried to recall bumping into something sharp, maybe catching myself on a fence or a piece of furniture, but no memory surfaced. The mark didn't hurt, didn't even itch, but it remained visible for weeks, a small red dot like a period at the end of a sentence I couldn't read. The third dream was more vivid than any waking moment I'd ever experienced. Every sensation was amplified, hyperreal. I could feel individual fibers in the sheets, could taste the artificial ozone scent on my tongue, could hear layers within the metallic voice that I hadn't noticed before. The oval light seemed closer now, and its pulsing had synchronized with my heartbeat, or perhaps my heartbeat had synchronized with it. The voice was clearer this time, though still not entirely comprehensible. It spoke in measured cadences, with pauses that felt significant, as though waiting for responses I couldn't give. I caught fragments: protocol, sequence, integration. The words felt familiar in a way that made my chest tight with anxiety I couldn't name. The sensation of being lifted was stronger now, more definite. I could feel my body rising from the bed, though when I tried to look down, I saw myself still lying there, motionless. The disconnect was profound and terrifying. I existed in two states simultaneously, lifted and prone, moving and still, aware and unconscious. The room around me began to shift. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in rhythm with the oval light. The familiar furniture became indistinct, as though seen through water or thick glass. Only the light remained constant, steady and patient above me, its gentle pulsing the only reliable constant in a reality that had become fluid. I tried to wake up, focusing all my will on opening my eyes, on moving my fingers, on breaking free from whatever held me in that suspended state. But the harder I fought, the more distant my physical body seemed to become. The metallic voice continued its patient recitation, and I began to suspect that it was reading about me, describing me, cataloging details of my existence with clinical precision. When I finally returned to consciousness, I was lying exactly as I had been in the dream, on my back with my arms at my sides. But I was covered in that same artificial ozone scent, and the taste in my mouth was so metallic I had to rinse it several times before it began to fade. The dreams began to bleed into my waking hours after that. I would be sitting at my desk, focused on work, when I would suddenly hear that constant hum, like someone modulating a frequency only I could hear. It would last for minutes at a time, a low thrumming that seemed to come from inside my skull rather than from any external source. Colleagues never seemed to notice it, continuing their conversations and activities as though nothing had changed. I started seeing lights that others couldn't see. Soft, oval-shaped glows that would appear in my peripheral vision, always just out of direct sight. When I turned to look at them, they would fade, but I could still sense their presence, patient and watchful. They appeared most often in the evening, when the natural light was fading and the artificial lights hadn't yet fully taken over. During that liminal period when day became night, they seemed most real, most present. My sense of time became unreliable. I would sit down to work and look up to find that hours had passed without my awareness. Entire afternoons would disappear into a hazy blur of routine activities that I couldn't quite remember performing. I would find evidence of my productivity, completed tasks and answered emails, but no memory of doing the work. It was as though I was functioning on autopilot, my conscious mind elsewhere while my body continued its daily patterns. The marks on my skin multiplied. Small, precise punctures appeared on my arms, my neck, behind my ears. Always perfectly round, always healing quickly, always appearing overnight without pain or memory of their creation. I began photographing them, creating a catalog of these mysterious wounds, but the images never seemed to capture them quite right. In photographs, they looked like ordinary scratches or insect bites, losing the surgical precision they displayed to my naked eye. I started losing track of conversations mid-sentence, finding myself standing in rooms with no memory of entering them, discovering objects moved from their usual places without any recollection of moving them. My life was becoming discontinuous, full of gaps and inconsistencies that I couldn't explain or ignore. The metallic voice began speaking to me during waking hours, always just at the edge of hearing, always just beyond comprehension. It would emerge from the hum of air conditioning, from the static between radio stations, from the white noise of distant traffic. I would catch those same fragments, protocol, sequence, integration, but now they seemed less like random words and more like instructions meant specifically for me. I began to suspect that what I had been calling dreams were something else entirely. The memories felt too solid, too detailed, too consistent. Real dreams fade upon waking, becoming fragmentary and surreal in daylight. But these experiences remained vivid and coherent, growing stronger rather than weaker as days passed. I could recall every sensation, every word of the metallic voice, every pulse of the oval light with crystalline clarity. The possibility that these weren't dreams at all began to take root in my mind. Perhaps they were memories of something that had actually happened, something that had been erased or suppressed but was now surfacing despite whatever force had tried to bury it. The physical evidence, the marks on my skin, the changes in my environment, the electronic interference, all seemed to support this theory. But if they weren't dreams, then what were they? And why couldn't I remember them as waking experiences? The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating a maze of uncertainty that grew more complex with each passing day. I found myself researching memory suppression, reading about psychological trauma and selective amnesia, about the brain's ability to hide experiences too difficult to process. But none of the literature quite fit my situation. My memories weren't suppressed, they were categorized differently, filed under dream rather than reality, despite their hyperreal quality and physical evidence. The boundary between sleeping and waking continued to erode. I would find myself in bed, experiencing that familiar lifting sensation, hearing the metallic voice, seeing the oval light, only to realize I was standing in my kitchen or sitting at my desk. The experiences were no longer confined to sleep. They were bleeding through into ordinary consciousness, transforming routine moments into something far more complex and unsettling. I began to feel watched constantly, not by anything visible or tangible, but by a presence that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of perception. It was patient and methodical, observing without judging, cataloging without interfering. The sensation was strongest during those episodes when the metallic voice would speak and the oval light would pulse, but it never fully disappeared, lingering in the background of even my most mundane activities. The voice became clearer with each episode, though its meaning remained elusive. I began to recognize patterns in its speech, recurring phrases and cadences that suggested structure and purpose. It wasn't random static or meaningless noise. It was communication, systematic and deliberate. But communication about what and directed toward whom remained mysteries that deepened rather than resolved with time. Last night I experienced what felt like the same dream that had started this entire sequence. I was lying in bed, the ceiling seemed higher than usual, and there was that soft, oval light pulsing gently above me. The silence was complete and heavy, pressing against my eardrums with familiar weight. The metallic voice began its patient recitation, speaking in those measured cadences about protocols and sequences and integration. But this time, when I tried to wake up, when I focused all my will on opening my eyes and returning to ordinary consciousness, something was different. I could feel the sheets beneath me, could smell that artificial ozone scent, could taste metal on my tongue. I could sense my body being lifted in that strange, motionless way that had become so familiar. And when I finally opened my eyes, expecting to find myself in my normal bedroom with the water stain in the corner and the familiar morning light filtering through ordinary curtains, I saw instead that the oval light was still there, still pulsing with that gentle, breathing rhythm. The metallic voice continued its recitation, clear and close and undeniably real. The sheets beneath me had that same smooth, synthetic texture they'd had in all the dreams. The air carried that sharp, clean scent of artificial ozone. And on the nightstand beside my bed, where no such thing had ever been before, sat a small device I'd never seen, its surface reflecting the pulsing oval light with mechanical precision. I reached out to touch it, and my fingers found it solid, real, impossibly present in a reality that was supposed to be separate from dreams. Story 10. The initial assessment showed all windows latched securely. Furniture placement appeared untouched, with chairs aligned to the dining table and the sofa free of debris. A calendar on the wall noted dates without any markings beyond printed numbers. In the kitchen, utensils were stowed correctly, though a single plate remained on the countertop, devoid of residue. The refrigerator hummed at the expected decibel level, yet its contents failed to match inventory records. The hallway carpet was vacuumed, leaving uniform lines, yet the air felt colder than usual. The ceiling fan was off, but the blades rotated slowly. That's the only part I trust completely. Everything else comes in pieces, like static between radio stations. There was this sound, sharp, metallic clicking that started somewhere behind my left ear and spread outward like ripples. I can still hear it when I concentrate too hard on remembering. Click, click, pause, click, mechanical but not quite machine-like, too organic, too wet. The smell hit me at the same time, ozone mixed with something copper-sweet, like licking a battery while standing in rain that never fell. My tongue went numb. The clicking stopped, but my ears kept ringing for what felt like hours. Or maybe minutes. Time moved differently then. Wasn't alone. That much cuts through the fog with crystal clarity. Someone was there or something was there, occupying the same space but not quite touching it. You know that feeling when you're certain someone's watching you, but when you turn around there's nothing. This was the opposite. I never saw anything, but I felt observed, studied. The air itself seemed to lean in closer, pressing against my skin with invisible weight. My peripheral vision caught movement that vanished the moment I tried to focus on it. Shadows that fell wrong, reflections that lagged behind their sources. I held my breath without meaning to, listening for footsteps that never came, waiting for a voice that never spoke. My thoughts weren't my own. That's the hardest part to explain without sounding completely unhinged. You know your own mental voice, right? The way your inner monologue sounds, the rhythm of your own thinking. Mine got scrambled. Words appeared in my head that I didn't choose in a cadence that felt foreign. Mathematical sequences I'd never learned, colors that don't have names. I'd start thinking about mundane things, what to eat for lunch, whether I'd lock the front door, and suddenly find myself calculating angles and frequencies that made no sense. My memory became unreliable. I'd walk into rooms and forget why, but remember with perfect clarity the atomic weight of elements I'd never studied. The boundary between my consciousness and something else got thin, permeable. Light behaved strangely. I remember that much with absolute certainty, though the details shift every time I try to pin them down. Beams that bent at impossible angles, casting shadows that pointed toward light sources instead of away from them. The fixtures in my house started flickering in patterns, not random electrical problems, but sequences. Morse code maybe, or binary, or something more complex than either. The patterns repeated, but never quite the same way twice. I found myself standing in my living room at some indeterminate hour, watching light dance across the walls in ways that hurt to follow with my eyes. The air shimmered, reality pixelated at the edges. Everything went silent, not quiet, but completely absent of sound, like the world had been muted. Then the humming started. Low frequency felt more than heard. My bones vibrated. The light stopped dancing and snapped back to normal so suddenly it felt like falling. The sensation never left completely. Even now, weeks or months later, time markers feel unreliable. I catch myself checking corners where shadows pool differently. My reflection in mirrors seems to lag by milliseconds. Food tastes metallic. Electronic devices glitch around me more often than they used to. I've started avoiding certain rooms in my house without any logical reason. The dining room chair that used to be my favorite now makes my skin crawl. I moved it to the basement, but I can still feel it there, occupying space below my feet. Sometimes I hear that clicking sound again, always just at the edge of perception, always from behind my left ear. My dreams have become more vivid and less sensible. I wake up with equations written on my notepad in handwriting that might be mine. But wait, that's not how it happened at all. The light didn't dance, it pulsed, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat made visible. I wasn't standing in the living room. I was sitting on my kitchen floor, back pressed against the refrigerator, feeling its vibrations travel through my spine. The humming didn't come from outside. It came from inside me, starting in my chest and radiating outward until my entire body became a tuning fork. My teeth ached from the frequency. The silence wasn't complete. I could hear my own blood moving through my veins, amplified and strange. When the episode ended, I found scratches on my arms that I didn't remember making. Thin, parallel lines like claw marks, but too precise to be accidental. They healed faster than they should have. Within days, they were gone completely, leaving only the memory of their sting. I've stopped trying to understand what happened to me. Understanding requires logic, and logic requires consistent facts, and my facts keep shifting like sand. What I know for certain is that something fundamental changed that night. Some boundary got crossed, some rule got broken, and I can't uncross it or unbreak it. I feel different in my own skin, hyper-aware of electromagnetic fields and barometric pressure changes. I notice things that other people don't seem to see, the way fluorescent lights pulse in specific patterns, how shadows sometimes move independently of their sources, the way certain frequencies make my vision blur. I become sensitive to things that shouldn't affect human perception. Part of me wants to investigate further, to document these changes and find patterns. But a larger part of me knows that digging deeper would be dangerous. Some memories are meant to stay fragmented. Some experiences are meant to remain half forgotten. I'm trying to learn to live with the gaps, to accept that my reality has become unreliable. The clicking sound is getting fainter. Most days, I can almost pretend nothing happened at all.